This is a classic case of type 1 autoimmune pancreatitis. Often when you look at this on very low power, what you'll notice is this very lobular pattern of growth, almost looking a little like a jigsaw puzzle. These are inflamed lobules surrounded by very fibrotic stroma. And it is in that fibrotic stroma that you'll find the most characteristic features of Igg4-related disease, and that is this. And perhaps this is not the best form of storiform type fibrosis, but it comes pretty close. You'll see fascicles of cells going in that direction, another going in this direction, another third one going in that direction. But that is not all. What is particularly characteristic, and that has always caught my eye, and this is very useful on a biopsy specimen, is this picture, what I call very cellular and inflamed interlobular stroma. Notice these cells, these are fibroblasts or myofibroblasts, very vesicular cells, but no atypia, and entrapped within the collagen of all of this are the plasma cells and the eosinophils. So this image to me is very characteristic of Igg4-related disease. All right, so we step away from there, and now you start seeing what's happening with the ducts. The ducts look perfectly preserved. What is often unique about this disease is that the ductal cells are perfectly preserved in spite of the fact that there is a collar of inflammation. Interestingly enough, this is type 1 autoimmune pancreatitis, but type 2 autoimmune pancreatitis, that collar around the ducts tends to be far more significant. Here's more of that very cellular stroma and vaguely storiform type fibrosis. Now, what I'm looking for is obliterative phlebitis. And interestingly enough, in this particular case, I found it hard to find, which is where an elastic stain comes in very handy. This is where I found the obliterative phlebitis, although I'll confess, not on the H&E, on the elastic stain. But before we go there, let's look at the H&E itself. This is the second section, and what you'll see is an interesting phenomenon going on at the interface between the pancreas and the peripancreatic fat. So I promise you that there is obliterative phlebitis somewhere here. Well, there's certainly an arterial channel here. And remember, an circumscribed aggregate of inflammatory cells adjacent to an arterial channel is very suggestive of obliterative phlebitis in type 1 autoimmune pancreatitis. Now, I clearly see the obliterative phlebitis here. Here's the artery, here's the accompanying vein, and that accompanying vein is filled with this very cellular inflammatory infiltrate. Acellular fibrosis in an obliterated vein means nothing to me. What you need is that very cellular infiltrate within that obliterated vein. Now, in retrospect, if you go back and compare these two images, that artery looks exactly like that artery, so that has got to be the obliterated vein. But there is no way I could have ever made a diagnosis of obliterative phlebitis on the H&E, and therein lies the power of your elastic stain. I illustrate this case without the immunostains to emphasize the fact that you can make a diagnosis of type 1 autoimmune pancreatitis without immunohistochemical stains. Often this is only possible on a resection specimen. So here's the Igg4 stain on the right, and I also have the IgG stain on the left. What I'm looking for in the Igg4 stain is a diffuse increase in Igg4 positive cells. I really do want it from one corner of the slide to the other corner of the slide, which is exactly what this image shows, right? So if I trace this, you can see a bazillion cells all over the slide. And here they are, a better look. In fact, the IgG stain tends to work very, very well. There's very little background staining. Unfortunately, I cannot say the same about the IgG preparation. In many cases, it is extremely challenging, so let's try and derive a ratio because that's what you're supposed to do. It's not practiced widely in the pancreas, but believe me, anytime the ratio exceeds 40%, that significantly increases the chances that you're dealing with type 1 autoimmune pancreatitis or Igg4 in general. Well, am I going to count? Probably not, because if you know, I've already decided that this is type 1 autoimmune pancreatitis and Igg4-related disease. That said, if I can get these at the same magnification, I can't really find the right field, but perhaps, let's say for the sake of argument, this is the right field. That ratio perhaps is around the 30 or 40% mark. So I'm happy with that ratio. So I also wanted to show you what happens to the bile duct in type 1 autoimmune pancreatitis. This is referred to as Igg4-related sclerosing cholangitis. And this is the bile duct, of course, extending here. Here's the lumen, the most inflamed bile duct you'll ever see. Now, there are other diseases that can cause a fair amount of inflammation of the bile duct. Classic example, primary sclerosing cholangitis. In fact, you can have elevated numbers of Igg4 positive cells in primary sclerosing cholangitis. You can have elevated numbers of Igg4 positive cells associated with a cholangiocarcinoma. So you cannot rely on the stain. The good old H&E will get you the answer. And unlike a lot of these diseases that I've just named, in Igg4-related sclerosing cholangitis, you'll see full thickness inflammation, all the way extending from the mucosa all the way through the full thickness of the bile duct. And when you look at this, you will see storiform fibrosis, you will see plasma cells, you will see lymphocytes. This is very typical. This is the basket weave sort of storiform fibrosis that you often see with Igg4-related disease. But it is that full thickness fibrosis that is very typical of the disease. Now, can you make that diagnosis in the biopsy? And I will argue with you that that is a huge challenge, because to me, deep down in the bile duct, this is the characteristic stuff that I want to see to make a diagnosis of Igg4-related disease. Unfortunately, your biopsies are going to be a little smidgens of this stuff. This area, to me, is very challenging to make a flat-footed diagnosis of Igg4-related disease based on a bile duct biopsy. And you never know if there's a cancer hiding back there. So I'm not a hematopathologist, but I can tell you that these germinal centers look very reactive. But there's something interesting going on in the subcapsular region. And a good friend of mine, Jake Bledsoe, I and Judy Ferry wrote this paper on Igg4-related disease of lymph nodes, where we showed that this subcapsular fibrosis should make you think of Igg4-related disease. And here you go. And if you take a very close look at the subcapsular fibrosis, it looks exactly like what you saw in the rest of the pancreas, with these lymphocytes, this dense collagen, this very cellular inflamed stroma, and these eosinophils. And here's the Igg4 stain, and you'll notice there's a diffuse increase in Igg4 positive plasma cells. In general, if you have Igg4 positive cells between germinal centers, that is more likely to represent Igg4-related disease. And indeed, while there are Igg4 positive cells in the germinal centers, the vast majority of these are outside the germinal centers. So that is very consistent with involvement of the lymph nodes by Igg4-related disease and type 1 autoimmune pancreatitis. Now, here's another feature that can be very, very helpful. Are those Igg4 positive plasma cells in the zones of fibrosis? And indeed, they are. And that is another feature which strongly indicates Igg4-related lymphadenopathy. So this particular lymph node demonstrated three characteristic features of Igg4-related lymphadenopathy. First, the subcapsular fibrosis with that very cellular infiltrate. Second, Igg4 positive cells between the germinal centers. And three, Igg4 positive cells within that subcapsular sinus. And finally, the elevated Igg4 to Igg ratio within the germinal centers, but more importantly, outside and between the germinal centers. That ratio, take it from me, is greater than 40%. So finally, the gallbladder, and this is Igg4-related cholecystitis. And this is a relatively easy diagnosis to make. What am I looking for? I am looking for inflammation and fibrosis outside the mucosal surface. So here's the mucosa. There's clearly inflammation here. In fact, there are perhaps a couple of eosinophils, although on second thought, I suspect those are, oh, they are eosinophils, of course. But that doesn't do it for me. What I'm looking for is almost this sort of mass-like lesion here. I'll trace it out for you on the serosal surface. It's like a plaque stuck on the serosal surface. So when the subserosal inflammation dominates the mucosal inflammation and is accompanied by fibrosis, think Igg4-related cholecystitis, and in most cases you'll be right. This is one of these manifestations where you tend to see a lot of eosinophils. Here are plasma cells as well. There's no classic storiform fibrosis, and there was obliterative phlebitis, but I needed an elastic stain to uncover it. But the bottom line here is that plaque-like inflammation and fibrosis on the serosal surface is your key histologic feature for a diagnosis of Igg4-related cholecystitis.